Akhil Sharma's novel Family Life is one of the most distilled, chilling, and lovely books I've ever read. It has at its core the sort of truth that has less to do with fact or autobiography than it does to do with poetry. The economy of Sharma's prose makes his stories impossible to look away from. The tragedy that befalls the family in Family Life happens the way accidents actually do, suddenly and mercilessly somewhere along the way. Sharma's placement of it brilliantly avoids borrowing shock that might have come from a different chronology or more lurid, less restrained treatment of the details. Like all masterful novels, Sharma's books ask and complicate questions rather than trying to answer them simply. What does it mean to move across the world and come of age in an unfamiliar, even hostile context? How do we as human beings make sense of the sometimes utterly senseless outcomes of our most banal and innocent actions? Diving into a pool one summer day, say, or moving, or having a drink. How do we cope with our crimes? My favorite possible answer to this is we read and write. It's when Ajay, the protagonist of Family Life, reads Hemingway that he begins to imagine his own life story as something potentially manageable. Sharma writes, "As I kept reading Hemingway, who seemed to so value suffering in silence, I began to see my family's pain as belonging in a story. In the morning, watching my father bathe Berju," this is his physically and neurologically devastated brother, "I fantasized about writing how my father's pajamas grew wet and translucent until I could see through to his underwear. At the idea of writing sentences that contained our suffering, I experienced both the triumph that I had felt when I told Jeff and Michael Boo about Berju, and also a sort of detachment, like I was watching my own life." In his novel Obedient Father, fathers can be viciously corrupt and abusive. Son-in-laws can die in an instant, slipping on oil slicks on their scooters, and daughters and granddaughters can come home when this happens, bringing with them a sadness so apparent you have to look away. Yet, as with Family Life, we watch and watch. Maybe because Ram, the tragically flawed father of Anita, who has her own powerful voice and chapters in the novel, is too complex and full of contradiction to be considered simply the sum of his worst crimes or inclinations. Ram recognizes himself as sentimentally political and reflects, "Big things do not happen, so you think time is not passing. You jiggle the years in your pocket, thinking you are a rich man, and suddenly you have spent everything. I was 38 and an old man overnight, and Anita was 12, and so young that seeing her was like looking down from some great height into a misty valley and wondering what will be revealed when the sun arrives." The sky in this dark political and family novel is a single blue from edge to edge. People are custom bound to serve meals with bribes, and a forehead can furrow into lines as straight as sentences in a book. In other words, the most elegant and meaningful moments in the human lives Akhil Sharma renders are tucked and woven among the most excruciating and brutal, which is why his work feels more real than real life. Truer, I think, than what we often as a society call truth. Watching Akhil Sharma watch human life has been one of the great pleasures of my and many of my colleagues and all of my students' reading lives. We are not, needless to say, the only ones to have noticed. After a multi-vectored career as a public policy major and investment banker, Sharma went on to win a Stegner Fellowship and then attend Harvard Law School. He is a professor in the MFA program at Rutgers, and this year the Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library. He has published stories in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, the Quarterly Fiction, the Best American Short Stories Anthology, and the O. Henry Awards Winners Anthology. And of course, his exquisite novels, An Obedient Father, which won the 2001 Hemingway Foundation PEN Award, and Family Life, which won the Folio Prize for Fiction and the 2016 International Dublin Literary Award. We are thrilled to have him here at the University of Chicago tonight. Please join me in welcoming Akhil Sharma.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for such a gracious introduction. You know, I always wonder, they have to be lying when people say such nice things. That's my issue, not, of course, Rachel's. I'm going to read from my two novels, from An Obedient Father, which I began writing, I think probably when I was 19 or so. And I think I finished it when I was 28 or so. And I worked on it on and off all through those years. So I'll read from the beginning and from about a third of the way in. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm going to try to speak louder, but I'm not, this is about the way that I talk. So this is the opening. And as I read, I'll comment on what my thinking was as I was writing it. I needed to force money from Father Joseph, and it made me nervous. He had bribed me once before for a building permit, soon after he became principal of Rosary School. Also, he had admitted my granddaughter Asha into his school without our having to make the enormous donation usually required. But Father Joseph was strange and unpredictable. So I began this is An Obedient Father, I began the book this way because, you want to get your reader interested, and the thing that people love most is fights. You can have people performing Hamlet up here. If two knuckleheads in the back begin punching each other, everybody will look at the knuckleheads. And so that's for me, it matters very much that people pay attention, that when I write something, people don't look away. So that I began I began the novel this way. What's interesting is, before I began writing the novel, so I mentioned this thing, then I go into background, and then this Father Joseph shows up later on. When I first began writing the book, that seemed to me very false, because it seemed like a tease to begin a novel this way, and then to drop it. But I remember reading The Moviegoer, which begins with a letter arriving, and then the letter isn't referred to until the very end of the chapter. And I thought, okay, if he can get away with it, why not me? I read other books to give myself permission to do things. For me, by the way, that did not work in The Moviegoer. It's important to remember to be aware of your own responses to works. Just because other people think it's good doesn't mean that it'll work for you. But that's where I got permission to do this thing. But Father Joseph was strange and unpredictable. You make this promise of a fight. As soon as you begin promising a fight, the reader wants more. And then you need to sort of reduce the reader's interest a tiny bit, because the reader will begin demanding plot. The easiest way to shift gears, right, is to switch into comedy. The reason being is that if you can make people laugh, people become patient. People think there's going to be other guffaws, so why not? I'll hang out. And so you can control the reader's mood a tiny bit. But Father Joseph was strange and unpredictable. Several months ago, his school in a posh part of Old Delhi had given a dinner party to introduce him. Because of my work for the Delhi Municipal Education Department, I was invited. During the party, Father Joseph demonstrated his expertise in karate. The party was in the school's front field. A steel pole had been cemented upright several meters from the buffet tables. Father Joseph, short and heavy with muscle, wearing the white robe of a karate teacher, beat at the pole for half an hour with his bare feet and fists, while 40 or 50 people watched and ate. Sometimes he would step a few feet from the pole and groan at it. Near the end of his demonstration, he became so tired that there were pauses as long as a minute between blows. Because this was so odd, and because Father Joseph had spoken to me in English when the party started, at first I thought the display might be an example of a foreign affectation. After he was done, still dressed in the robe, Father Joseph spent the rest of the night meeting his guests. He kept clenching and unclenching his hands from soreness. So once you've sort of switched gears a tiny bit, once you've slowed down the reader's demands, then you can do more things. You've got the reader invite into the book. You've sort of slowed down the reader's demands, and now you can begin. So you have a little bit of space, a tiny bit of space where you can begin to do some world building. No matter what anybody says, it's very hard for the reader to invest into a world without some amount of things to attach to visually through the senses. Because I've been reading a lot of Chekhov, and Chekhov tends to have his visuals about 2/3 of the way into a sentence, right? And so because the visual gets buried, it feels like things are occurring in darkness, in sort of a dim light. So the lady with the little dog is, people were talking on the embankment. There was a new face, a lady with a little little dog. But the fact that the image is so far into the sentence means that things are occurring in darkness. And the way that people invest in that sort of environment is very different, and it becomes much more fluid. So anyway, that's not what I do in this book. So we now have some humor, and now we need to begin doing some world building. It was morning. The sky was a single blue from edge to edge. I had just bathed and was on my balcony hanging a towel over the ledge. The May heat was so intense that as soon as I stepped out of the flat, sweat appeared on my bald scalp. In the squatter colony behind our compound, several women crouched before their huts, cooking breakfast on kerosene stoves. 2 men wearing only shorts and rubber slippers stood next to a hand pump, soaping their bodies. On the roof of a nearby building, a woman was bathing her daughter with a tin bucket and a bowl. The naked girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, kept slipping out of her mother's grasp and running about the roof. I had been Mr. Gupta's money man for a little less than a year and was no good. It did not take me long to realize this, and once I did, unwilling to give up the increased pay, I tried to delight in having achieved a position that exceeded my ability. I enjoyed believing that I had tricked Mr. Gupta into giving me a place near all the illegal money that poured through the education department. This pleased me so much that I pictured myself weeping in the middle of negotiations with some school principal and calling myself a whore while I kept a hand over my heart. But on the mornings before bribe collections, these fantasies came involuntarily. Now, instead of making me laugh, they made me feel threatened, as if I were crazy and out of control. The principals I extorted were better educated than I was and generally far more competent and responsible. I had never graduated from higher secondary, and my job as a junior officer in the physical education department officially involved little more than counting cricket bats and badminton rackets and making sure that 4% of a school's land was used for physical education. My panic in negotiations was so apparent that even people who were eager to bribe me became resentful. At the meals they were custom bound to serve with the bribe, they joked about my weight. "You're as good as 2 men," they might say as I piled food on my plate, or would remark, "Have you been fasting?" With principals who appeared even more uncertain than I was, I sometimes grew angry to the point of incoherence. Occasionally, because of my heart attack 7 months earlier and the medicines I now took, as I talked with them, I got tired, confused, and sleepy. So I have this guy basically berating himself constantly, the narrator. And the reason is that later on we learn that he's a child molester. And if when the reader learns this about him, the reader will hate him. And so by having him berate himself constantly, to some extent, the reader feels that all the hatred, all the justified anger is already being poured on the character. And so the reader doesn't have to hate. And the reader, therefore, remains slightly detached and is not as judgmental as would otherwise occur. Another reason that it's possible to write from the point of view, to have this story, is one, of course, it's a novel, and we don't. If somebody murders their landlady with an axe, we're kind of forgiving of it, inside a book. But the other is that it's a first-person narrative, and the I compromises us as readers. I am doing this, I am doing that. All of us have done things that shame us, and to some that I makes it harder for us to get away with saying, "Oh, this person is completely different from who I am." The I is always reminding us that this guy is strange and awful, but I've done some stuff which is not cool either. I'll continue reading. My general incompetence and laziness at work had been apparent for so long that I now think it was arrogant of Mr. Gupta to pick me as his money man. I am the type of person who does not make sure that a file includes all the pages it must have, or that the pages are in the right order. I refuse to accept even properly placed blame. Lying outright that somebody else had misplaced the completed forms or spilled tea on them, even though I was the last one to sign them out or had the soggy papers still on my desk. All this is common for a certain type of civil servant who knows that he is viewed with disdain by his superiors and that he cannot lose his job. My predecessor as money man, Mr. Bajwa, used to lie even about what he had brought for lunch. He would rather eat on the office roof than not lie. Mr. Bajwa, however, had incredible energy. He also had a compulsion to quote everyone who came near him. Many times he had told me that I was one of his best friends, even though it was apparent that he did not like me. He had to be replaced because when VP Singh defeated Rajiv Gandhi and became Prime Minister in the last elections, the Central Bureau of Investigation wanted to show its loyalty to the new rulers by attacking the Congress Party and its supporters. They brought corruption charges against Mr. Bajwa. Since then, Rajiv Gandhi had forced out VP Singh and put Rajiv's pawn Chandrasekhar in power, and the upcoming elections might make Rajiv Gandhi Prime Minister again. When the mother finished bathing her daughter, I went inside. He's a child molester. We don't know this as of now. The narrator moves into reverie when he's standing on the roof and he looks at this naked girl being bathed. The naked girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, kept slipping out of her mother's grasp and running about the roof. And then we move into reverie. I had been Mr. Gupta's money man. And he's in reverie because he's a little bit like a snake, looking at a potential victim. Or a cat looking at a bird, just sort of enormously focused on this problem, this thing. And when the girl leaves, when the mother finished bathing her daughter, I went inside. When the girl leaves, he leaves as well. This is not something that most readers would notice, As a writer, you have to care more than your reader. No reader is going to care as much as you care. And so you have to go and fix all these things that will never be seen. I was talking to this guy who makes suits, and he was saying that almost all of the work, almost all of the very, very expensive work is inside the suit, inside behind the lining where it can't be seen, like how neatly the stitches are of the canvas, giving the thing shape. Nobody knows this. The customers don't know this, and even the people who are willing to pay for it, right? Even the people who can get us will pay $4,000 for a suit versus $800 for a suit or $700 for a suit. Probably even they don't appreciate it, and it's a fetish object. But as an artist, you have to care for it. And I found that I think that's accurate, that about almost everything you have to care, because there's no point in doing something if you don't care. And if you care, then you have to try to pay attention to every detail. A friend of mine who's a famous musician, a rock star, said that when he performs, almost half of the audience, if he performs badly, almost half of the audience cannot tell if he's performing badly. They just are unable to. They've come because of his name and it's funny, it's like the vanity that artists have, all artists have. So this guy was telling me that when he performs, sometimes all these young women take off their clothes in front of the stage. And I said, is that cool to... And he said it makes him really scared, because first of all, anybody who's doing that is probably out of their mind on drugs. And then the second thing it makes him feel is that he feels ashamed. That he thinks that he's trying to do his best, to make art, and to him, he's just some monkey making noise, because, and it's funny, what one wants is not adoration, but appreciation. It's to be deserving of admiration that we want, not admiration itself. I'll read from further into the book. So at this point, the narrator has been caught sort of fondling his granddaughter. Rajiv Gandhi has been assassinated. The city, Delhi, is under curfew. It's also the anniversary of his wife's death. And because he's sort of a bumbling, incompetent guy, he hadn't gone out to arrange the pandit until this particular moment, and so until the last possible moment. So now he has to go out into a city which is under curfew, and he's also sort of completely overwrought, because he's been caught doing this awful thing, and by his daughter has caught him fondling his granddaughter, And he's so scared as to what's going to happen that his whole life is going to be turned upside down. So he has now left the house, his apartment, which is in basically a slum. I grew up in this sort of house, and we were proud that we weren't the slum, because the slum was we looked onto the slum that is built along the edge of the wall of the house that we lived in. And it's funny, we were not very different from these people, but it mattered so much to us, these fine distinctions. So he leaves his house, his apartment. The sky was bright and cool. For May, the weather was mild. The entrance to the squatter colony was blocked by a pile of sandbags. The doors were guarded by a neighbor, a young man with an enormous and ancient gun. My grandfather killed a lion with this, he said. He shut the doors behind me as soon as I stepped into the alley. The piece of road I could see from the alleyway was empty of traffic. Shops had their grills pulled down over their fronts. Rajiv Gandhi's death would have closed the banks too, I realized. The ordinariness of this detail reminded me of my nature. He had been thinking about sort of taking money from the bank and just vanishing. I did not have the stamina to disappear. A rickshaw driver sat in his vehicle at the mouth of the alley, smoking a bidi and regarding the thoroughfare. I came up to him and stopped. The roofs on both sides of the street were completely lined with men, women, and children, waiting to see what would happen. I thought of floods I have seen during which everyone in town is forced to live on a roof, but the road was empty. I did not know whether a curfew had been declared, but even without one, few people would take the risk of going out. I wondered at Anita having left the flat. That's his daughter. She had gone out to get the newspaper. 7 or 8 men in their 20s stood bunched together several meters to the right of me on the sidewalk. The top buttons of their shirts were open, and as if this were how they recognized each other, most wore canvas shoes with clumsily copied foreign emblems sewn on. The hoodlums were staring at a Bata shoe shop directly opposite the alleyway. Behind an iron grill fixed to the ground by heavy locks was a large window displaying Bata shoes. The shop was owned by a Sikh, and I knew it was symbolically important that the first shop looted belonged to a Sikh or a Muslim. If I died in a riot, it occurred to me I would never have to speak with Anita again. The hoodlums talked and joked among themselves, but kept looking at the shoe shop. Their bodies were tensed and, when not moving, tilted automatically towards the shop. I wondered if what had happened after Indira Gandhi's assassination would be repeated. For several days after her murder, the roofs of most of the houses in the old vegetable market remained crowded, and bunches of looting men roamed the streets. Periodically, people spilled from their homes and a riot started. Then, after a while, a tank or some military jeeps appeared and the roads were abandoned once more. The butchering of Sikhs and Muslims, shooting them, knifing them, hanging them, setting them on fire, continued for weeks after they had been chased out of mixed neighborhoods. I stared at the shop, the hoodlums, the people on the roof. I felt as if the blue sky had become solid and the whole country was under a lid. Not wanting to return home, I stayed where I was. A half hour passed. I watched the blue sky and the silent full roofs. The world felt impossible, like a door larger than the building it belonged to. But this impossibility was strangely comforting. The world had changed, and I must have changed with it. The Sikh's wife stepped out of a narrow, dark staircase next to the shop. She was fat and wore a green salwar kameez. I had never spoken with her, but I had seen her working in the shop and buying milk from the same milkman I used. She stood in front of the steps for a moment and looked up and down. She avoided meeting any of the eyes that were focused on her. When she stepped aside, 2 young boys, about 6 and 10, came out of the staircase. They were dressed in blue and maroon school uniforms, and their hair was neatly bunned in small white handkerchiefs. They looked as if they had just bathed. The boys' wet cleanness made me think of newborn rabbits. Making them look young was smart, but I doubted it would help. A moment after the boys, a fat, white-haired woman dressed in a widow-white salwar kameez emerged. This was the Sikh's mother. I began to feel sad. The Sikh's wife stepped to the edge of the sidewalk and waved to the rickshaw driver. He looked at her coolly and continued to smoke. He was 18 or 19 and had short, bristly hair. To be out on such a day signified the rickshaw driver's predatoriness. One of the hoodlums said, "Bitch." Everyone else remained silent, and the word expanded in the air. I sensed the attention of people on the roof. The older boy took the younger one's hand. The woman kept motioning for the rickshaw driver long after it was obvious that he was not going to move. Perhaps she thought that if she stopped motioning, the next part of something preordained would happen. I wondered how much time it would take to murder the Sikhs. The men would probably make a game of getting them away from the stairs. They might be threatened till the women and children started crying and pleading to be allowed to leave. After the hoodlums had let themselves be bribed, the rickshaw would be ordered forward. The Sikhs would get in, the rickshaw driver would pedal in the exact center of the road and be leaning as far away from his passengers as possible. Then the hoodlums might start running alongside the rickshaw, laughing and talking among themselves or completely silently. They would begin punching and tugging the women and children. After a block or two, they might grab one of the boys and drag him into the street. Then the rickshaw driver would jump off and run away. "Go, friend," I said to the rickshaw driver. I was surprised at having spoken. Once the words were uttered, I felt complete confidence. The rickshaw driver looked at me. He was small with thin arms. I smiled and cocked my head in the Sikh's direction. "They are women and children," I said in a loud, casual voice. "The Sikh, he's still up there." The hoodlums must have been surprised as well, for when the rickshaw driver glanced toward them, no one made a gesture. I felt the authority of being incongruous. An old, very fat man dressed in the white shirt and dark pants of a bureaucrat, standing in the open when a riot might start. I was glad that Delhi did not have the fanatics of Bombay, that confusion alone might stop people. The rickshaw driver pedaled across the street. When he got to the Sikhs, he pulled the rickshaw parallel to the sidewalk and asked, "Where to?" as if there were any other passengers. "Morris Nagar," the Sikh's wife said. 50 rupees, he responded loudly. The hoodlums rustled at the outrageous sum. The family got on. The women sat on the sides and the children in between. The hoodlums looked at each other in confusion. I started walking in the middle of the road toward the temple. The rickshaw driver passed me. He was leaning almost halfway over the handlebars. The rickshaw got farther and farther ahead of me until I was alone on the road. The Sikh must be watching his family from behind a curtain, I thought. In my head, I saw his door being smashed open and him being clubbed and stabbed. Then my scalp prickled as I imagined a brick curving in flight toward me from one of the rooftops. The temple doors were closed and the alcove next to them where a man usually sits was empty. I tried the doors and they opened. I was impressed that the Pandit had been courageous enough not to lock them. You know, in every book there's all sorts of weird problems. So, for example, for several days after her murder, this is Indira Gandhi's murder, the roofs of most of the houses in the old vegetable market remained crowded and bunches of looting men roamed the streets. Periodically, people spilled from their homes and a riot started. Then after a while, a tank or some military jeeps appeared and the roads were abandoned once more. The butchering of Sikhs and Muslims, shooting them, knifing them, hanging them, setting them on fire. After Indira Gandhi was assassinated, it was Sikhs who were murdered, not Muslims. When I was writing the thing, I needed a second word. I felt I needed a second word, so I put in Sikhs and then I put in Muslims. And I told myself I have to go back and change it, but I forgot. So in the reprinted version, it's just Sikhs. All writers feel some sense of competitiveness towards all other writers, is my belief. And when you're a writer who's sort of labeled as an Indian writer, you feel that the pie is even smaller. And I remember when one of the guys who reviewed me made a big point of that, about this mistake in the book, which is, it's helpful for him to, the good thing is that you find the mistake and you fix it, so you take your help from wherever it comes. The reason I didn't especially feel bad about it is that all books contain these sort of mistakes. So, for example, if you read the Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway writes about these people walking with miles of sort of fishing line. There's an essay I once read about how this is not true, that a mile of fishing line weighs this much. And so, obviously he's just saying this thing out of not being totally certain about the details and feeling that it sounds right. And how many people have read that essay and how many people have read The Old Man and the Sea? So that gave me comfort. So that was one thing where I thought, I got to go fix this, and I did not fix it. Another place where I did know I wanted to pick something and I kept forgetting to do it, or that I did remember to do it, was a half hour passed. I watched the blue sky and the silent full roofs. The world felt impossible, like a door larger than the building it belonged to. So I had, you always want to make, fiction is not about the truth, it is the truth, right? So when you're saying something feels impossible, you want to make it, you want to generate the sensation of impossibility. And I remember in a Faulkner novel or novella, it might be, I forget which one, As I Lay Dying, there's somebody who says that the world felt impossible like a bullet bigger than a field. And I remember reading that and thinking that there was something not sufficient about the image, and so I put in as a placeholder, like the world felt impossible like a shoe bigger than a city block, because that's such an awful image that would keep making me go back and work on it. And so eventually I came to this idea that the world felt impossible like a door larger than the building it belonged to. And so the reason I feel like the impossibility thing works is because you have two images, like a door bigger than the building it's attached to, versus Faulkner's image, which is a bullet bigger than a field. So his sentence, his little machine, is missing a slight gear, I think. It's always sort of bizarrely vain to talk about a great writer and say, oh, this is a slight mistake, or this could have been done better by him. He's a better writer than I will ever be. And it was his impossibility, the fact that to me it didn't work, that made me work so hard on this thing. The reason he begins fantasizing about the violence is because you need to make it real for the reader, right? If you don't make it real for the reader, there isn't as much tension. The reader can only fill in what they know. So unless you've been in a riot, like I was in Delhi right after Indira Gandhi's assassination, and I was walking down the streets and the roofs were full of people watching to see when can you run down and steal stuff. And so unless you've been in a riot, that tension doesn't exist. So you have to have this character imagine all the violence that will occur. One of the things that I did not read when I was reading just now was, after a block or two, they might grab one of the boys and drag him into the street. Then the rickshaw driver would jump off and run away. I remembered the dead naked Muslim boy of 40 years ago whose shoulder had been opened so that white bone showed. I didn't read that because as an audience don't know about this Muslim boy who was murdered during the riots following independence. One of the things to remember when you're writing fiction is to keep bringing the old history up, right? Because whenever we're constantly remembering and referring to things that occurred in our past, either directly or somewhere, subliminally. And so part of making a character feel real is regularly bringing back these old memories. Almost everything I've written has been influenced by other writers. So when I mentioned whose shoulder had been opened so that white bone showed, that image of the horror of the violence being not so much the dead person or the wounded person, but the cleanness of the white bone, that's an image from Death in the Afternoon, Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon. So, I'm always trying to see where I can borrow, Sometimes I feel scared that maybe I have borrowed too much, that I've wandered into plagiarism. And I was reading a story I wrote where I feel that I had felt really embarrassed, that I felt that I had taken something, directly lifted too much of a Cheever story. And then I read the Cheever story in my own story, and I thought, what was I thinking? Why did I even have this doubt that I was sort of plagiarizing? In the Cheever story, this woman says no to a man and puts her hands on his chest, and something similar occurs in my story. And I think when you're writing and when you're being so influenced and so aware of your influences, at least for me, there's this enormous dread that I'm taking too much. So I'll read a tiny bit from Family Life. When I was a little boy, I used to think my father had been assigned to us by the government. This was because he appeared to serve no purpose. When he got home in the evening, all he did was sit in his chair in the living room, drink tea, and read the paper. Often he looked angry. By the time we left for America, I knew that the government had not sent him to live with us. Still, I continued to think he served no purpose. When I read from Family Life, I often begin with this just because it's sort of sweet and charming, and you got to bring the reader in. Always be selling. And now I'll go back to the very beginning. As far back as I can remember, my parents have bothered each other. In India, we lived in 2 cement rooms on the roof of a 2-story house in Delhi. The bathroom stood separate from the living quarters. It had a sink attached to the outside of one of the walls. Each night, my father would stand before the sink, the sky full of stars, and brush his teeth till his gums bled. Then he would spit the blood into the sink and turn to my mother and say, "Death, Shubha, death. No matter what we do, we will all die." Yes, yes, beat drums, my mother said once. Tell the newspapers too. Make sure everyone knows this thing you have discovered. Like many people of her generation, those born before independence, my mother viewed gloom as unpatriotic. To complain was to show that one was not willing to accept difficulties, that one was not willing to do the hard work that was needed to build the country. My father is 2 years older than my mother. Unlike her, he saw dishonesty and selfishness everywhere. Not only did he see these things, but he believed that everybody else did too, and that they were deliberately not acknowledging what they saw. My mother's irritation at his spitting blood he interpreted as hypocrisy. I spent 12 and a half years writing this book, Family Life. It's not even a long book, I wrote about 7,000 pages. I wrote, from the point of view of the boy who narrates it. I told it from the point of view of the father, the point of view of the mother. I did third person, all sorts of weird things, just to try to find a way into the book. And I just had a hard time. It was just a very, very difficult time for me. People ask, when did I realize this thing was almost done, and it was, for me, a story is done or a book is done when certain qualities begin to appear in the prose. So for me, it was when really beautiful stuff began to be right next to idiocy, right? So for me, I'm oftentimes sort of amazed how the most wonderful things in life, things that are sacred, are right next to utter dopiness, utter moronicness. So for example, when I began to see each night my father would stand before the sink, the sky full of stars, and brush his teeth till his gums bled, I thought, okay, this is it, we're almost done, we're almost baked. The other thing that I look for in what I write is that I want all of my characters to be right and I want all of my characters to be wrong. Because I think that's just what life is, Obviously some people are more wrong than others, but but everybody has problems, everybody has blind spots. So, the fact that the mother, says, what is the value of pointless gloom, right? How are we helped by it? How does that lead us to happiness? That's a very reasonable point. That's the point of view of a mentally healthy person. But her motivation for doing it is, what will the neighbors think? So her thinking is correct, but her motivation is flawed, which means that eventually the thinking will get flawed as well. And then the father is, of course, insane, that he thinks everybody is a liar, everybody is a thief. Unless, of course, if you've been to India, it might make sense to think that way. This book this scene is set in the 70s. And what's sort of weird is how everything changes, especially in a place like India where you now have pollution, such massive pollution. When I was there, we didn't have cars, when I was growing up there. So it would be very exotic when if a car came onto the street. And now because of, my family lived next to this swamp. And at night, all the frogs and the crickets were making noise. And now, because of pollution, all the frogs are dead, all the crickets are dead, and so night sounds very different. And so what one would think of as fixed and permanent, what does night sound like? That's gone. When I was growing up in Delhi, there were neighborhoods which didn't have electricity. And so you would say about a neighborhood, oh, that neighborhood has electricity. And now, of course, everything is electrified. When I was growing up in Delhi, you wouldn't turn on the electricity until the very last possible moment, right? And so you wouldn't turn it on until night had arrived, right? And so until you couldn't basically read numbers as you were writing. And so you would, so because there's very little ambient light, darkness would come very, very fast, right? And you'd be standing on a street corner, and you would watch a man walking across the street, and the person would fade as they walked, because it would come that swiftly. And so all this sense of what is the world, we talk about the immutable things, right? When we write fiction, that the people have always been the same. The characters in Stendhal are the same as the characters in the books that people write today, right? So that when we talk about, people have always felt confused, they've always felt a sense of uselessness, they've always had these thoughts. That's true, but the world is changing, and changing in really profound ways, and oftentimes we lose things, bits, and we don't even know we've lost them. And so to me, to some extent, these are almost historical items. I'll just read a little bit more. My father was an accountant. He went to the American consulate and stood in the line that circled around the courtyard. He submitted his paperwork for a visa. My father had wanted to emigrate to the West ever since he was in his early 20s, ever since America liberalized its immigration policies in 1965. His wish was born out of self-loathing. Often when he walked down a street in India, he would feel that the buildings he passed were indifferent to him, that he mattered so little to them that he might as well not have been born. Because he attributed this feeling to his circumstances and not to the fact that he was the sort of person who sensed buildings having opinions of him. He believed that if he were somewhere else, especially somewhere where he earned in dollars and so was rich, he would be a different person and not feel the way he did. Another reason he wanted to emigrate was that he saw the West as glamorous with the excitement of science. In India in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, science felt very much like magic. I remember that when we turned on the radio, first the voices would sound far away, and then they would rush at us, and this created the sense of the machine making some special effort just for us. Of everybody in my family, my father loved science the most. The way he tried to bring it into his life was by going to medical clinics and having his urine tested. Of course, hypochondria had something to do with this. My father felt that there was something wrong with him, and perhaps this was a simple thing that a doctor could fix. Also, when he sat in the clinics and talked to doctors in lab coats, he felt that he was close to important things, that what the doctors were doing was the same as what doctors would do in England or Germany or America, and so he was already there in those foreign countries. To understand the glamour of science, it is important to remember that the 60s and 70s were the era of the Green Revolution. Science seemed the most important thing in the world. Even I, as a child of 5 or 6, knew that because of the Green Revolution, there was now fodder in the summer, and so people who would have died were now saved. The Green Revolution was affecting everything. I heard my mother discuss soy recipes with neighbors and talk about how soy was as good as cheese. All over Delhi, Mother Dairy was putting up its cement kiosk with a blue drop on the side. That the Green Revolution had come from the West, that organizations like the Ford Foundation had brought it to us without expectation of gain or payment, made the West seem a place for great goodness. I personally think that all the anti-Western movies of the 70s, like Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, and Purab of Prasham, sprang not from the unease of hippies arriving, but from our sense of inferiority before the munificence of the West. My mother had no interest in emigrating for herself. She was a high school teacher of economics, and she liked her job. She said that teaching was the best job possible, that one received respect and one learned things as well as taught them. Yet my mother was aware that the West would provide me and my brother with opportunities. Then came the emergency. After Indira Gandhi suspended the constitution and put thousands of people in jail, my parents, like nearly everyone, lost faith in the government. Before then, my parents, even my father, were proud enough of India being independent that when they saw a cloud, they would think, that's an Indian cloud. After the emergency, they began to feel that even though they were ordinary and not likely to get into trouble with the government, it might still be better to leave. In 1978, my father left for America. These details that I put in about Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, and Purab of Paschim, they're not really relevant to the majority of my readers, right? The majority of my readers are Western, so these movies don't have meaning to them. The reason I put them in is to make my bones, to show that, hey, I know this world, right? There's no corner of this world that I don't know. And it isn't actually as much for the Western reader as for the general claim that one needs to make that this is coming from some authentic place. Obviously, if it was harmful to the book, I would not put it in. So I put that in there because for that purpose. The thing about the radio, the voices would sound far away and then they would rush at us. I remember reading Cheever's story, The Enormous Radio, and he talks about that detail. And I suddenly remembered, oh yeah, that was true of my childhood. And it's funny to realize to be reminded of your own past from these people. I remember reading one of Flaubert's letters talking about how after his sister died, and that there had been so much crying that it felt like you'd gone on a trip and on a stagecoach and all the dust had gotten into your eyes, and so your eyes are always red. And I remember that's what it felt like for me, after my brother. That's what I had thought, that it felt like my brother had an accident which caused brain damage. I remember thinking, it feels just like when you've been on a long bus trip, because your eyes are always raw. And it's funny to me, when you open yourself up to books and you allow them to echo inside you, how much of yourself gets revealed, all these memories that you had forgotten. My brother had this accident. I remember after his accident, crying, and it's thinking, the way that, trauma causes you to interrogate yourself, and thinking, would I rather if you weren't here? Like would I rather if you had not been a part of my life? And I said, no, I would rather have this grief. This grief is a part of him. This is what remains of him. And I remember reading in a Shakespeare play, this mother talks about her son dying, and somebody saying, oh, you cry too much, and you give too much weight to your grief, or something like that. And she says, my grief lies in my son's bed. It stuffs itself into his clothes and walks beside me. It's very moving. And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, I remember this guy 500 years ago was talking about my life. And I think that that's what books do. This is why, for me, they're the most important thing in the world. Before I began, because I was writing about my parents, about my own family, I felt I had to sort of ask permission. And so I spoke to my father about it. My father doesn't like to read. Doesn't like to read. If you were to tell him that you'd read a book, he would think you were showing off, that you were trying to make him feel bad by pretending you were better than you were. And so when I told him that I was going to write this book, he said, Akhil, if you want to keep a secret, put it in a book. And when I told my mother this, she said, Akhil, I said, would you mind if I wrote this? And she said, just make me look good. So my parents are wonderful people, very strange people, but quite wonderful. All of my family is civil servants, and a lot of the bizarre behavior in an obedient father is stuff from my family, the civil servant bad behavior. So my father, for example, he's retired now, but when he was working, he would refuse to go to any meeting unless there was food that was going to be served. Because he said, why bother? Why should I go to a meeting? They can't fire me. So anyway, that's what all I was planning to read.